Folks, welcome to this week's edition of Tech Sales Advice. I am, of course, your host, Chris White. And for starters, happy Halloween, everyone. I thought about putting on a costume, but that's a little bit over the top for me. But for those of you out there that actually celebrate this holiday, happy Halloween. And folks, I want to just mention, most of you, if you've listened to this before, these are live conversations. We are coming to you live. This is the LinkedIn Live program for technical sales professionals and technical sales leaders. And as I like to say, by design, these conversations are unscripted, unrehearsed, and unpredictable. And we have the absolute perfect guest to have an unscripted and unrehearsed conversation. His name is Matt Abrahams. He is a lecturer and professor at Stanford University. By the way, I visited the campus about a year ago. Beautiful campus. He's also the host of a podcast called Think Faster and Talk Smarter. And he quite literally wrote the book called, and I just had it up on my phone here because I've got it on my, I don't know. Yeah, there we go. I've got it on Audible. Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And it's all about it. And I literally wrote these words down: how to handle challenging, spontaneous speaking situations, which as pre-sales professionals, sales engineers, we quite literally make a living doing that. So Matt, with that very long-winded welcome and introduction, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing great. And I have to ask, Chris, what would the costume have been had you dressed up today? I would have been Where's Waldo, because I'm always trying to find my way.
So I love, by the way, love that. I am dying to see if I can pull off Ted Lasso.
I can see it. I can see it. You got a little bit of, I can see it.
I need the mustache, right? I need the mustache, and I'd have to have, sort of the cardigan sweater or some sort of sweater, but that's what I would, the khakis.
Chris, I believe in you.
Well played. Yeah. Well played, Matt. And just already demonstrating the ability to think on your feet. So Matt, we're gonna dive into Think Faster and Talk Smarter. And I know there's three very specific things that you want to chat about. But before we get into it, could I trouble you to, and by the way, we've already got a few people commenting on LinkedIn. Folks, we don't see you out there. So if you do care to say hello, please feel free to do so. And of course, if you have any questions for Matt and or myself, please feel free to ask. I'm going to try to get my questions in, but by all means, if you have a question, you want to put the expert, on the spot. Let's see if he can think fast and talk smart. What was the genesis of this book, or the idea that led you to write this book?
A couple of things came together to lead to this book. First and foremost, I've been teaching communication skills for over 25 years, and it was very clear to me that planned communication, presenting, giving a pitch, running a meeting with an agenda, those are skills that we all can derive value from and need to learn. But really, when you think about it, most of our communication happens in the moment. It's being asked for feedback, being asked questions, being asked to introduce yourself, making small talk. Much of what we do is in the moment. And about 9 years ago, the deans of Stanford's Business School, where I've been teaching for many, many years, came to me and said, we have a problem. Our students, very bright business minds, who know the answers to questions, are choking, are unable to answer during that cold call. And Chris, you remember the professor says, what do you think? And you have to respond. So as the communication guy, they came to me and they said, can you help? And that's when I did a deep dive into the academic research, from psychology to anthropology, neuroscience, even improvisation and acting. And from that, I built a methodology. And now every Stanford MBA, within the first 3 weeks of being on campus, has the opportunity to take a class where we help them think fast and talk smart. And that methodology, I began teaching not just to my MBAs, but to other folks in my coaching practice. And it became very clear to me that it was incredibly helpful, way beyond just the academic classrooms I was teaching in. And that's what led to the podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, and the book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter.
Yeah. Yeah. And when was the book published, Matt?
The book came out literally 4 weeks ago. So we are not even at our month birthday yet.
So I have to admit, I didn't realize it was even that brand new. So
Yeah.
fantastic, and congratulations. And you've done a couple. So I've been preparing for this. I've been listening to the audiobook. I found a couple TED Talks that
Yep.
you've done. So how many TED Talks have you done at this point now?
So I've done 2 TEDx talks, and I have a very big talk that was done for the Stanford Graduate School of Business School, defined again by the name Think Fast, Talk Smart. So if you want to check it out, you can Google that and you'll find that talk. And then there are 2 TED Talks, both about how to manage anxiety when speaking. Many people feel very nervous. The first book I wrote was called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, because it turns out that if you can't manage the anxiety around speaking, all of these other steps and tools become very, very hard.
Yeah, yeah. Were you always a gifted speaker, or was this something that you had to learn for yourself? And then once you learned it for yourself, you thought, you know what, I think I can help others develop these skills.
It's a little of both. So with the last name Abrahams, I have always been going first. I mean, all through school, I always knew where my seat was. I was always the first to go. So spontaneous speaking is something I got used to. The planned speaking, where I would have to get up and give a formal presentation, I was very, very nervous. And it took me many, many years to learn to manage that anxiety. And as a result of that, I did a deep dive into how to learn to be more comfortable and confident speaking. And that's where the first book came from. And a lot of the work I do is helping people feel comfortable and confident in the moment, but also in planned communication.
And I have to say, I just so respect the work that you do. And I've only researched, if I can use that term, your work over the past few months, but love what you're doing. And look, it's very similar to what I at least aspire to do with many of the clients that I work with. The communication that my clients do is in a very specific and organized structure in many cases.
Yes.
But to your point, I think deals are actually won and lost from a software sales perspective. I think deals are actually won and lost based on how we respond to questions from customers and or prospects.
I think that's absolutely right. I had a 10-year career in high tech. I ran learning and development for software companies. I trained a lot of sales engineers. And you're absolutely right. The ones who are most successful are the ones who are agile and can adjust and adapt based on the needs of the moment and the needs of the prospect and customer. So these skills, I think, apply very directly in sales as well as many other professions.
Amen. So Matt, we're going to dive into some of those skills. There are a few people that I want to say hello to. First, a good friend of mine, Andy Ryan, has chimed in. Andy, my friend, good to see you up in Boston, Massachusetts. Chris Hickey has chimed in with a few comments. It looks like, I hope I'm saying this right, Manu Kamkar from Fremont. Welcome. Chris is up in Chicago. So Matt, let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these skills. When you and I chatted a few weeks ago, you mentioned, Chris, I think there's 3 things that I want to talk about. And the first thing you mentioned was connection, which honestly caught me a little bit by surprise. Do you mind elaborating on what do you mean by connection?
Well, fundamentally, I think the sole purpose of communication is to connect. The word literally means, in its etymology, means to make common. And I think if we all reflect on our personal relationships, even our good, close professional relationships, we feel a sense of connection, and communication allows us to do that. The problem is many of us in our communication strive for perfection. We want to do it right, whatever that it is, the pitch, the conversation, whatever. We want to do it right. And I'm here to tell you, Chris, after studying this for decades, there is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but there is no one right way. And putting all that intense pressure on ourselves to do it right, to be perfect in our communication, works against us. I mean, you know technology as well as many of the folks listening. Our brains work in many ways like a computer. It's not a perfect analogy, but when you have lots of windows or apps open on your phone or your laptop, your CPU, your central processing unit, is not processing each of those tools as effectively as it can. Its bandwidth is stretched. When I am constantly judging and evaluating everything I'm saying, trying to get it right or trying to follow that script, I reduce the cognitive bandwidth I have, just like your CPU does, in trying to actually communicate. So rather than focus so much on getting it right, if we can turn that volume down and focus more on connecting, getting the message across, saying what's relevant for the person I'm speaking to, we can be much more successful, not only in what we say, but making that have a better impression on the person we're saying it to. So I have the audacity to my Stanford MBA students to say, maximize mediocrity. And these students have never heard that. They've always been told to be the best you can. But in so doing, by just getting it done, just being mediocre, you free up all this bandwidth to do it really well. So by the end of my first class, when I introduce this concept, I say maximize mediocrity so you can achieve greatness in your communication. And they get it by focusing on the connection, what's relevant, rather than what they're trying to do and do it right. You actually do it better.
You've just made me feel a lot better about this conversation and running this LinkedIn Live, because now I'm not striving to hit a high bar as much as accepting that mediocrity is okay. And I think when you and I were chatting a few weeks ago, you said, honestly, Chris, in most cases, mediocre is probably above average in many cases. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We hold ourselves to very high standards, especially when it comes to communication. If you ask people who are great communicators, they'll say amazing TED speakers, they'll say senior leaders who are politicians. All of these people have been trained and coached and practiced, and in some cases edited what we see. So we're holding ourselves to a really high standard when in fact, that's not, one, normal or natural, and two, it's not needed. If you just actually connect, pay attention, listen, do what's relevant, then you have good quality communication. So we set the bar too high and we fixate on being perfect. And those two things get in the way of what is important.
Love that. So, and if I can repeat sort of in my words, Matt, what you're saying is that if I'm focusing so much on what it is that I'm saying and I'm sort of self-assessing and diagnosing as I'm speaking, what's happening is, first of all, my brain is spending too much bandwidth on focusing on myself and my words and my thoughts as opposed to the other person. And I'm missing out on the opportunity to really make that connection. And the more and this is a term I use, I'm curious to see if you like this term. The term that I've used before is clear our mental cache.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of like clearing the cache. Clear your mental cache, forget about what you're thinking, and really tune into the individual that you're communicating with. And the more you can connect with him or her, the better your communication is going to be almost naturally. And it may not be perfect or ideal, but it's going to be it's more likely to be relevant to that individual and to the conversation. I mean, is that another way to interpret what you're saying?
I love it. In fact, I love alliteration. And as long as you haven't trademarked that, I'm going to say we need to clear our cognitive cache to connect and communicate well. It's got all the C sounds in it. And it's really, really important. I mean, the reality is this, and we all know this, you have to be agile and adept. And if I am locked in my head, I can't adjust and adapt to what's happening in the moment. And as sales engineers, things happen in the moment. The demo doesn't work. Somebody asks a question you didn't expect. All of a sudden, something happens in the moment that you have to respond to. If you are present, focused, and that mental cache is cleared, you will do better.
Present, focused. I love that. There's two words that you just used that if you're okay with, I'd like to double click on.
Sure.
You said agile and adept. And this is particularly interesting to me because, and I don't know if I shared this with you when we chatted recently, a number of years, in fact, 15 years ago, more, almost 20 years ago, I went through a professional career development program, and I went through a series of tests, like aptitude tests. And one of the things that was tested for was rate of idea flow. Like literally, how quickly do you tend to just generate ideas? And I scored very, very high. And as a result, what this gentleman who I worked with, who I'm still friends with today, said is, you'd probably be very good on your feet speaking to an audience because you just think fast. Is this something that is just a natural either you have it or you don't? Or is this something that people can learn how to do?
Well, I absolutely believe people can learn to do it. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in my students and the people I coach. So in the book and in the methodology I've created, there's some counterintuitive ideas. And one of the counterintuitive ideas is that many of us feel like I'm either have it or I don't. I've got the gift of gab. I've got the ability to quickly and creatively come up with ideas, or I don't. And in fact, these
Mm,
are skills that you can learn. It takes practice. It takes three things. And it's true of any skill you want to take on. It's repetition, reflection, and feedback. You need to
mm.
practice, you need to reflect, and then you need to get feedback from others. So yes, you absolutely can get better at it. I think idea flow is an interesting metric that contributes to, not solely, but is part of the equation of what helps us to think faster. A good friend of mine, Jeremy Utley, co-wrote a book called Idea Flow, and he talks a lot about how to
Interesting.
generate lots of ideas. But it's only one part of the equation. We need to not just have quick ideas, but we also need to be able to do pattern recognition. When I talk about think
Mm,
faster, I'm talking about pattern recognition. We're seeing things that we've seen before. We're connecting dots that we can then act on. It's much like an athlete. I use a lot of analogies to athletics. An athlete trains by doing lots of practice and lots of drills so that in the moment they can recognize certain patterns. And from that, act on it and execute certain plays. So it's not just about creating lots of ideas. You can actually overwhelm yourself with ideas, so much so that you get bottled up and you can't speak. It's being able to think quickly, but it's also seeing those patterns that really help.
yeah. Matt, I'm going to just press our pause button just for a moment. There's a few other folks saying hello. Musa from, I hope I'm saying that right, from Paris, France.
Wow.
And it looks like Brian Taft just ordered the book. So glad, Brian, good on you. I'm about halfway through. I think you'll enjoy it. And Chris Hickey made a comment as well. So we've talked about connection, and I literally wrote this down. It literally means to make in common or to have
Yeah.
in common. And so
Mhm.
really we're trying to establish by connecting with the individual, clearing our cache, focusing on what they are saying, we're creating that common ground. By the way, something that I just did with you, I'm curious if this is something that you talk about or teach in your class, is notice how a moment ago I circled back on two very specific words that you used. Now, was that a technique that you ever talk about, or did I do something there that aligns with one of the things that you recommend?
Absolutely. The ability to paraphrase is really important
Mm,
to ask follow-up questions. Many of us in our spontaneous speaking feel that it is important to respond very quickly. We have this notion that time to response signals confidence and competence. And I don't think that's always true. I believe that it's okay to take a pause, to take a beat, to say, give me a moment to think about that. You're still responding, but you can collect your thoughts. Many of us just start talking and discover what we really want to say as we're saying it. And that leads to a big problem, which is not being clear and concise and rambling. One of the tools that can really help you buy time is paraphrasing, summarizing what you heard somebody say,
mm.
not word for word. So you don't say, so what I hear you saying is, and repeat word for word. Rather, you extract key ideas. And in addition to paraphrasing, you can ask follow-up questions. This is a
Okay.
great way to buy yourself some time. It's a great
Amen.
way to confirm that you've heard what was actually said. It validates the other person so they feel good. So I think paraphrasing and asking follow-on questions is a very useful skill. I talk in the book, one step of the methodology is listening. And
Mm,
listening is so critical to effective
mm,
spontaneous speaking. And paraphrasing and follow-on questions are important to that part of the process.
mm. Well, and I gotta say, Matt, you just verified and validated a key point that I make in some of my workshops. So that is very, very satisfying for me. I just want to recognize Alex McFerrin just bought the book on Audible. So
Thank
that's
you.
fantastic, folks. I'm talking to Matt Abrahams. He wrote the book. It's right behind him. Think Faster, Talk Smarter. It's been out for about a month. I'm going to go as far as to say it's must-read material for sales engineers because he has developed a framework for how best to respond in what he calls challenging, spontaneous what's the right word? Speaking
Speaking
situations.
situations, yes.
And we literally make a living learning how to master that skill. So we've talked about the importance of connection in our communication style and the ability to handle these challenging, spontaneous speaking situations. The next thing that you mentioned when we chatted a few weeks ago was structure and the importance of structure. Could I trouble you to elaborate on how structure applies to this situation and these scenarios?
Absolutely, 100%. And structure is so critical. Let me first define what it is. I'll say why it's important, and then I'll give you some examples. So the first, by the way, do you see what I just did? I'm
I
structuring my
see
talk.
exactly what you
Right?
just did.
So structure is the logical connection of ideas. We have a tendency, especially when put on the spot, to list information. Our brains are not wired for lists. I mean, think about it. How many things can you remember on your shopping list before you have to consult it? We are not
Two.
very good at lists. Yet when we communicate, we use lists and bullet points all the time. We are not serving our audience well, nor are we helping ourselves. Our brains are wired to process information that's logically connected, stories, if you will. In fact, long-term memory is often called episodic memory, episodes. We remember things that have a beginning, middle, and an end. So when we go to speak, planned or spontaneous, it is in our best interest to have information logically connected. Now, there are many, many structures that you can rely on. Let me share one that I believe many of your sales engineer audience will be familiar with. Anybody who's ever pitched or persuaded has likely used a technique or some variation of it called problem, solution, benefit. Here's a problem or opportunity. Here's how we solve it. This is what our service, our product, our features do. And then here's the benefit to you. When you package things up that way, it's easily digestible by your audience. You've put it into a package that I can process and remember as your audience. Additionally, you as the communicator, it helps you form a logical path that you're going to go down. It gives you a roadmap, if you will. It helps you prioritize what to say. If it's not part of the problem, solution, or benefit, I probably shouldn't say it. And it builds in transitions. I like to use the analogy of a tour guide. Whenever you communicate, you're like a tour guide. The number one rule of any tour guide is never lose your tour group. How does a good tour guide keep people together? They set your expectations up front. They tell you where you're going, where you're not going, and then they keep you connected through each point on the tour. I was a tour guide once. I was a tour guide when I was in college. And the place you lose people the most is when you move from one spot to the next. They just wander off. The same thing is true in your communication. If you don't connect your ideas together, people get lost. So if you find yourself saying so, next, second, you're not using complex enough transitions to keep people together. So structures like problem, solution, benefit can be very helpful. In the book, the whole second half of the book is really about 6 different specific speaking situations that are spontaneous, and I apply a structure to each one. Pitching is one of them. I talk about problem, solution, benefit. I have another structure I love for elevator pitching, but it's also answering questions, giving feedback, making small talk. All of these skills are directly applicable to anybody who is in sales, in pre-sales, in technical sales. Absolutely helpful.
Your guidance and expertise is just so well received. First of all, you mentioned problem, solution, benefit. Honestly, it's a good reminder for me, because even sometimes I think I fall into the trap of listing out a collection of sort of best practices instead of for each one saying, here's the problem that we fall into. Now the solution is, and the benefit to you is, and what's coming to mind for me is, let's say I were giving a presentation or a demo, and there were 5 key points that I wanted to make. I could use that little model there for each of the 5 points that I'm trying to make. Correct?
That's absolutely right.
Thereby bringing my audience along for that journey.
Yes, I think 5 is a lot. So I might challenge you to say, is there a way to combine those 5 into 3 or 4?
The 3.
Yeah, threes tend to work really well. But the point is, thinking through what's the most
Mm.
logical way to package the information up is the real value that you're adding there. Think about it this way. Most of the time we communicate spontaneously. The information we are conveying can be used later by the person we're speaking to. And if we package it up in a nice way, they can then pass it on much more easily. Give you two situations. In a job interview, the person hiring you is not typically the person, or the person interviewing you is not typically the person who hires you. They need to take information you give them and share it with other people. If I
Love that.
package it up nicely and easily, they can do it better. If you're in a pre-sales call, the people in the room aren't always the people that have to make that decision. They have to then take what they heard from you, go share it with somebody else who also might be hearing information from your competitors. And if the folks you have empowered through your structured messaging can communicate your point better, you're at an advantage over your competitors. So thinking through structure really, really does help.
It's funny. You and I think a lot alike on so many things, and I'm literally picturing a presentation that I did a few years ago for a client, and one of the conversations was storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, here are the 3 benefits of storytelling and weaving stories into your presentation. Number 1, they are relatable.
Uh-huh.
Number 2, they are memorable. And number 3, they are shareable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely what you just said. Right?
I love that. I love that. And if all of us would think of our stories in that way, it would be really helpful for us to be successful. Most of us just think about getting information out and getting the communication done. We don't think about how to package it in a way that can be useful and helpful to the people we're speaking to.
Well, and the other thing that comes to mind hearing you say that is it's when we're and this is more the planned presentation, but it's as much about what we don't say as it is what we do say, right? The ability to exclude the unnecessary is as important as including and packaging and structuring it in a way that is relatable and shareable.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The 6th step of my 6-step methodology is what I call the F word of communication. It's not the naughty one sometimes people think about. It's focus. And that focus is determining what to say and what not to say. And I believe the single best way to get focused is to think about what's most relevant, salient, and important to your audience. That's where you start from. You know, my mother has this saying. I know she didn't create it, but I love it. It's tell me the time, don't build me the clock. And many sales engineers and technical people are clock builders. They take us through the whole rationale and logic for how they got to where they are. They might be wanting to show how deep their knowledge is. That gets in the way of us actually understanding. So your point about sometimes the most effective thing to do in communication is to remove information so it becomes most salient. So I encourage everybody to think about focus in how they communicate.
Love that. Matt, may I share my favorite analogy, similar to your mom's
Sure,
blog
absolutely.
analogy?
Absolutely.
And
You've
I don't
already
know
told
I don't know if I said this to you when we chatted before or not. And many people listening may know this. I call it my golden rule of selling technology.
Yes.
He or she who buys a shovel doesn't want a shovel. They want a hole.
Yeah.
But they don't just want a hole. They want a fence or a tree.
Yes.
They don't just want a fence or a tree. They want privacy or shade or fruit or flowers. Yet we show up, and I literally keep it in the office for this reason, Matt. We show up and want to talk about the shiny shovel, and we talk about the blade and the handle and how wonderfully built it is, right? That's sort of analogous to your mother's tell me the time, don't build me a watch, right?
I love that you have a shovel in your office. I think the analogy is exactly right. I'm often asked what are the best books I think about communication. And I think a great book is Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath. It really talks about how to make ideas stick in your mind. And they tell a story that's exactly like your story. And they talk about selling a drill. The way to sell a drill is not to sell all the features of the drill. The way to sell the drill is to talk about how you can hang all your family pictures perfectly so you can see them whenever you want. And
Amen.
it's this notion of focusing on what's relevant and salient. So a drill might, maybe it's all power tools and tools that you need to get this point across, but I love that you have a shovel in your office. I totally, I love it.
It usually goes over well. There's one more thing that you mentioned that I want to double back on, and then we'll go to the third sort of key point I think we're going to talk about. But you were talking about the tour guide.
Yes.
And you mentioned that where do they lose their audience? They lose it in the transition.
Yes.
And it reminded me, and again, it's frankly, it's validating to hear this from the expert. One of the things that I recommend to the people that I work with is when you're particularly if you're practicing, say your pitch deck, right? Your PowerPoint, don't just practice what it is you're going to say on the slide. Practice what you're going to say, but in the transition between the slides. Because if there's not a logical transition, it just feels like a random collection of points as opposed to a narrative or a story. And that's precisely what you're talking about there.
That's absolutely right. You know, it is in those transitions that you really reinforce what you're saying. You connect the ideas together, you connect the audience to those ideas. And if you're team presenting, and I know many times in pre-sale situations, it's a team presentation.
Absolutely.
You also get the ability to transition, not just content, but person. And that's very useful as well. Transitions are often under focused on and overlooked, and that gets in the way of really being able to keep your audience together and help them remember what's going on.
100%. 100%. Matt, let me press our pause button again, folks. I'm speaking to Matt Abrahams. He is the author of Think Faster and Talk Smarter. It's been out for about a month. If you're listening and have not picked up this book, I could not encourage you strongly enough to do so, particularly if you're in sales or pre-sales. Jason Zekowitz, another good friend of mine I've chatted with a number of times. It's good to see you, sharing a few comments. Some other LinkedIn user, unfortunately, we don't see your name, but making a comment about storytelling makes the human connection. Yep. Very, very well said. So, Matt, so we've talked about the importance of connection. Mm-hmm. And I use the term clear our cache and really focus on the individual. And you mentioned worry less about what it is that you're saying. Don't try to be perfect. Really tune into the individual. And I literally wrote it down, the master mediocrity.
Yes.
Because that's good enough. And now the second thing we've talked about here is being structured. And in fact, you beautifully demonstrated structure by explaining the what, the why, and the how. And the importance, you use the term episodic, which I love, that our minds don't think in terms of lists. They think in terms of stories. They think in terms of the narrative. So if you're going to respond, there really needs to be a narrative as opposed to a bullet list of thoughts, right? Random thoughts. The third thing that you and I were going to talk about is some of the specific challenges, I think, that and situations that people are put in, and some of the advice that you have for people in certain situations. Do you care to touch on a few of those?
Yes. So certainly there are many situations that we find ourselves in where we have to speak in the moment and speak spontaneously. Let's take feedback and Q&A as two examples. We are often put on the spot to give feedback to our colleagues, perhaps to our prospects, customers. Feedback can be really fraught with challenges. The first thing I'd like to say about feedback is that we need to see it as an opportunity to problem solve. The best feedback, praise or constructive criticism, is done collaboratively. So it's not just me telling you something, it's me asking you to work with me to fix whatever that is. So we need to see it as an opportunity to problem solve, which means we need to make sure that the person we're giving the feedback to is not put on the defensive. When giving feedback, especially constructive, it should be part of a regular stream of feedback. So instead of the once a year, come in, do the performance review, you should be giving feedback to your peers, to the people you manage on a regular basis, both positive and negative. So any constructive feedback is seen in the larger whole of your concern about the person, rather than you just parachute in and say, you're doing this wrong, and fix it. I have a structure that I really like for feedback, and it works really well for other things. It is 3 simple questions. What? So what? Now what? What is your feedback? So I might say something like, the meeting you just came out of, Chris, went really well, except when you were talking about the implementation plan. You talked very quickly and you didn't give as much detail as you did elsewhere. That's the what. So what? The why. When you speak quickly without giving a lot of detail, people might think you're not as prepared or you're nervous. That's the so what. Next time, I'd like for you to slow down and include these 2 examples. That's the now what. Do you see how that's packaged very nicely? I can come up with that in the spot. You could literally ask me to give you feedback, and I could simply say, what's my feedback? Why is it important? What would I like to see differently? And it packages it nicely. Similarly, when we're answering questions, we can leverage a structure. I like to call this structure ADD, for adding value. You answer the question, you give a concrete example to support it, and then you explain the relevance of that. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you to put me on the spot and ask me a question, and I will answer it in ADD, and people will hear it. I've used this structure throughout our conversation today, but now I really want to highlight it. So imagine you are interviewing me to be, how about a podcast host? I, like you, host a podcast. It's called Think Fast, Talk Smart. It's all about communication. Imagine there's an opening to do that role that I'm currently doing. You are the producer of that show. What's a question you might ask? And please make it a question that just doesn't have a yes, no answer.
Yeah,
Something I actually have to answer. What might you ask? I'm putting you on the spot, and I apologize, but I want to demonstrate this.
Have you ever been in a situation where you were interviewing someone on your podcast and they were struggling, you were struggling to get quality information out of them? And if so, how did you handle that situation?
Whenever I interview anybody on my podcast, I always make sure in advance to spend some time with them to understand how they normally communicate and what their comfort level is. For example, I just interviewed an expert from a leading business school to talk about negotiation skills. And this person was a very nervous speaker. And in our pre-chat, I learned about this anxiety, and I talked about how we are just talking with each other. We don't have to worry about the mics. And I asked the person to share a story or 2 about when they've been successful getting ideas across. And that really helped calm them down. So whenever I am in a situation where I have to interview somebody, I always take the time to get to know them, and I make sure that I bring out the best in their ability. So if you listen to that answer, I answered it first by giving the answer. I then gave a concrete example so you could see how it played out. And then I explained how that answer applies to the long term, the relevance it has. So by answering a question, giving a detailed example that reinforces the answer, and then connecting the dots, explaining why it's relevant, you give a complete and thorough answer. So thank you for being put on the spot and asking me a question. I hope that structure of answer, detailed example, describe relevance was clear and helpful to people.
I think it was fantastic. And by the way, folks, let me reiterate, these conversations are unrehearsed, unscripted, unrehearsed, and unpredictable. I didn't know Matt was going to ask me to do that, and Matt had no idea what question I was going to ask him. And I'm pretty impressed with his response. So I think that's a great example. I want to go back. Actually, before I go there, in the example you just gave,
yes,
I'm curious to see if you think there's one of the 3 elements that you shared that is usually the hardest for people. And if so, which one of the 3?
I don't know that there's one that's always hard for folks. I think a lot of us forget to do the last step of ADD, that is providing the relevance. We assume people can connect the dots. We assume that if I put this in front of you, you'll be able to see how this links and connects. And, the very first psychology class I ever took in college, the professor came out and his first words are etched in my brain. It was, the funny thing about common sense is it's not so common. And it's very true that we it seems abundantly clear to me that if I show you how this feature works, you will see the benefit in doing so. That's not always the case. So I think it's important that people take the time to answer the question. In my mind, whenever I use ADD, that second D, that describe the relevance, I'm thinking what this means for you is. So before I gave the answer I gave to you, I said, here's my answer. For example, what this means for you is. And that's how I remind myself to make sure to get that part there. So it's often forgotten. I don't know that it's hard. I think people they know why they think it's important. They just don't take the time to share it.
And I was thinking precisely the same thing. When you went through that, what struck me is how easy it is and how commonly people leave off the relevance. And you use the term connect the dots. I mean, that's precisely what I was thinking. Jason asked, what is ADD? Can you repeat for the audience what each letter stands for again?
Absolutely. And it's one of the chapters in the book. It's ADD stands for answer the question. That's the A. The first D is detail an example. So you give a detailed example that reinforces the answer. And then finally, the second D is describe the relevance or value. So ADD for adding value to your answers. So if you were to ask me, let me give you another example to make it very clear. If you were to ask me my experience, say that you're interviewing me to do what I do, which is be a lecturer at Stanford's Business School, I might say, I have 25 years of experience teaching communication skills. That's my answer. My example would be, I've taught both at the graduate and undergraduate level in the corporate world as well as the academic world. That's my concrete example. Describe the value or relevance, I would say, what this means is I can tailor my content to be specific to the needs of your students. So answer, detailed example, describe the relevance. And if you practice this, it will help. I encourage everybody listening in. I bet your organization somewhere has frequently asked questions, FAQs. Take every one of those FAQs and put it into ADD. By doing so, you'll train your brain. You'll drill it so it becomes more comfortable for you. And anybody who subsequently reads the FAQ will see the answer in that structure, and they will begin through osmosis to understand that structure. So the only way you get better at this is to practice it. And I think taking existing FAQs and putting it in that structure can be really helpful.
Yeah. Jason responded, how about explain, briefly, exemplify, and enact?
That works for me too. I think any structure works. Many people are familiar with STAR, situation, task, analysis, results. There are lots of structures out there. Find ones that work for you and leverage them. I am not wedded to any one structure. I am wedded to the concept of structure. Find what works for you and use it.
Love that. But by the way, another friend, Rue Dickinson, he and I finally met in person a few weeks ago and actually did a LinkedIn Live. Rue, well, and I love what he said. What this means is that's another way to do that. Rue, thanks for chiming in. Good to see you, my friend. Matt, you have been so gracious with your time. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. As I like to say, the landing gear is out. The runway is in sight. We're gonna land this plane here soon. There's probably two things that I'd like to ask you about briefly, just because they're very fresh in mind. I ran a workshop yesterday afternoon, and we were covering a topic around presenting to customers. This was a sales organization that I was working with. And there were two things that I shared with the group that I have a bit of a pet peeve with, and I explained it, but I'd like to share the scenario to you and with you, and I'm curious to get your feedback. One of them was when we're handling objections, the group was saying, well, oftentimes, and we did a little bit of a role play, and somebody played the role of the customer and shared an objective, and the individual said, I totally understand, and then sort of moved on to their point. And I said, Mike, what I struggle with there is you said you totally understand, and maybe you do, but unless you explain why it is you understand, until you say, I think what you're saying is, or I think I understand, and here's the point, and they say back to you, yes, you've got it. I think I totally understand can actually be a negative, be received negatively. Do you have an opinion on that? And if so, what might that be?
If you don't demonstrate your understanding, if you just say you understand, I think you are, one, perhaps not clear on what's being said and you haven't demonstrated it, but you miss an opportunity to really connect and validate. So that's where that paraphrasing we talked about earlier comes in. So instead of me saying I understand, I would say I understand and then follow it up with my understanding. So I understand, Chris, that this is an issue for you and you think that people really do need to clearly demonstrate their understanding. So in that paraphrase, I now have demonstrated that I clearly understand you by rephrasing or reframing. I do think it is important to validate that you do hear and understand and accept, or at least entertain what other people have said. And I think you do that not just by saying it, but by demonstrating it. And that's where the paraphrase really helps.
Amen. And by the way, I literally wrote these words down. You miss the opportunity to connect and validate. And by the way, folks, and anybody who's listening to me talk, I mean, look, our greatest need, our greatest emotional need, it's just a human need, is to feel understood and validated.
Yeah.
And the more people feel understood and validated, the more likely they are at least to hear your side of the conversation, right? So absolutely love that. Okay, there's one other scenario that came up, and I hear this frequently. And that is when a customer or a prospect, we're giving a demo, a prospect asks us a question, and we respond with great question. And by the way, I'm the one. In fact, Rue Dickinson and I were talking about this a few weeks ago. I was in this one demo once. In fact, it was in York, Pennsylvania, and I was still relatively early in my career as a pre-sales professional. And I was giving a demo. It became sort of a running joke in the room. Like at one point, somebody asked a question and somebody else chimed in with, "Let me guess, Chris, good question." So it clearly was becoming disingenuous. But this is what I said to the group. I said, I don't have a problem with you saying great question, but if it is a great question, tell them why you think it's a great question. And because I can see where you might misinterpret, or I can see where it might be easy to think this. I'm really glad you asked. Do you have another just sort of response to that as well, Matt?
So I 100% agree that when people say great question or good question, that it is distracting and they're using it not to really commend the person. They're typically using it to buy themselves time to think and speak. And I really think when we say good question, what we mean is good. I know the answer to that question. Because when you get the question that you don't know, you don't say good question. So it loses its value. I think what's most important is to demonstrate you understood the question by paraphrasing. If it truly is an insightful question, say so. Say, hey, that's an insightful question. And I like your idea of explaining why you think that's the case. But these are called heuristics, shortcuts that we use to help buy ourselves time or fulfill some other obligation. You do not need to reward every question. You can simply say, thank you for that question if you wish. I think a paraphrase is the best reward because you're demonstrating you're really trying to understand it. The other pet peeve I have is on the other end of questioning, where people will say, after they answer the question, did that make sense?
Do you understand?
Does that make sense? Yeah, do you understand? Right? And if you listen to somebody who says that enough, you begin thinking, do they really make sense? Do they say things that are understandable? If you want to follow up and confirm that the other person has taken in your answer, you can say, do you have a follow-up question? You could ask, what more can I tell you? So if the goal is to confirm that they got it, ask more directly rather than does that make sense? So you've got to avoid good question at the front end and does that make sense at the back end?
The other thing people can do, and you did it just a moment ago when you asked me to ask you a question, and then you answered the question, and then you explained what it was you did, and then you said, do you see how I structured A, B, and C together?
Yes.
That was what I call a mini close or a closing question. Right. And so you demonstrated that in real time. Matt, I want to give you a few minutes because I know that you've got to get in front of some students here in just a few minutes. I cannot thank you enough for this conversation. You have just been a wealth of insights and knowledge. Any closing words or parting words from you, sir, as we wrap things up?
Well, first, Chris, thank you very much. This was incredibly enjoyable. I love the fact that you have a shovel. The notion of clearing the cognitive cache is one that I'm going to leverage. I just want to remind everybody, communication is critical to success in your business and professional and personal lives. We can get better at it. It takes practice. It takes reflection and research into your audience, but we can get better. And I invite you to listen in to Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast I host. Check out the book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And since we're on LinkedIn, feel free to link in with me as well. So thanks so much, Chris, for the opportunity to connect. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
Matt, this has been fantastic, sir. Thank you so much. I know you've got to run. Folks, for those of you who hung around the whole time, thank you so much. Matt, I'm going to invite you back next year to see how the book is doing, if you're okay with that. Folks, if you're interested, follow Tech Sales Advisors or Tech Sales Advice, hashtag Tech Sales Advice. Matt, I know you got to run, so you go. Folks, thank you very much. We'll see you next week on Tech Sales Advice. Cheers, all.